Hello, everybody. My name's Laurence Dawkins-Hall. I'm an applicant support mentor for the Science Council, and the object of today's video is to actually talk about competencies, specifically to define what they are, give you examples of competencies that, with any luck, you can recapitulate as examples of your own self-reflective practice in competency forms that you personally write. And finally, I'm going to actually make reference to the three registers, RSci Tech, RSci and CSci, and give examples of competencies in the context of one or more of those registers. So what are the competencies? Competencies are essentially the skills that you use holistically in the workplace. So that isn't just technical skills. It is things like organizing your time, planning your time, and actually responsibilities that you may have over and above either data analysis or project work, such as training others, such as organizing the lab as a technician on behalf of others. These are all suitable subject materials for the competency form. So essentially what we have are 4 competencies, and I'll come on to the 5th competency, professionalism, at the end. But the 4 competencies mentioned here are the application of knowledge and understanding. This is really talking shop. This is about, if you're a bioinformatician, how you actually analyze your data. If you are a project scientist and you perform actually wet-based lab science, it's how you actually go about doing that, how you troubleshoot the experiments, how you follow the SOP. But of course, in devising your actual experiments in the lab, for example, it may be necessary to actually research things that you need to know. So application of knowledge and understanding can also incorporate aspects of research, as well as downstream data analysis, okay? It isn't purely about the actual practicalities of lab-based science itself. Personal responsibility is about how you manage your time vis-a-vis, let's say, your supervisor, if you work as a single individual, or if you train others and are responsible, as I've just alluded to in A, for the actual upkeep of the lab and the maintenance of equipment in the lab. How do you actually divest your time? How do you plan your time to cope with those different subject streams or responsibilities within your daily, weekly remit? Interpersonal skills and communication is about communicating with specialists who share your subject knowledge, also non-specialists in the context of training, problem solving, etc. It's also the modality of presentation, okay? It's about using tools like Teams, or using PowerPoint or Microsoft publication when you present at a conference. Professional practice is actually about adhering to certain standards. It's about applying and updating those standards, and that may relate to A. It's also about scoping and planning new projects that you might take on. They may relate to lab-based work. They may be more departmental. They may be more structural and involve non-specialist like estates and services. If you are a higher technician aspiring to, let's say, a CSci, a chartered scientist qualification. But maybe the first thing I should do before I actually delve into specific examples is just give you a brief overview of the actual 3 registers, so you're clear how these 3 registers relate to the examples that I'm going to give you of self-reflective practice. An RSci Tech is someone that is not a rookie, so they can follow a housekeeping protocol, a standard operating procedure independently. They're able to actually therefore work independently in the lab or in terms of data analysis or in the field, but they may not be expected to demonstrate troubleshooting skills in the context of their report. So they're typically someone with 1 year's experience. And as I've mentioned before, it isn't just about personal bench work. As a technician, you might be responsible for the keep of equipment or housekeeping of equipment and consumables within the lab on behalf of others. So it's looking at all those modalities of practice. An RSI is someone typically with a little bit more experience, 2 to 5 years. And in addition to actually following competently a standard operating procedure independently, if they hit a roadblock, they would be expected to demonstrate in their competency form that based on that additional knowledge compared to a registered science technician, that they might be able to troubleshoot that roadblock and therefore independently generate the data, whereas an RSI tech might confer if it falls outside the strict standard operating procedure, if it's non-standard. A registered scientist would be expected to improvise in order to actually demonstrate improvisation in order to actually complete their experiment. A CSI is quasi-managerial, okay? So apart from training PhD students or junior staff, which is something actually an RSI does, they might be expected to so-called bench supervise. So actually have an input in terms of staff, in terms of designing experiments, also help those staff in terms of the data output and what it means. So they're more invested in terms of the training. It isn't training per se, it's supervision. It's looking at the data as well as the experimental design, in addition to actually training them in the standard operating procedures and the associated health and safety, COSH. For a CSI, for a more senior technician, there might be other roles associated with CSI, such as lab infrastructure issues, okay? Maybe there's upkeep or improvements to the lab. Maybe it's structural, so they're dealing with estates and services. They might also be responsible for managing small consumables budget. So in that regard, they have a financial component to their job description, which perhaps RSI and certainly not RSI Tech would typically have. So what I'm going to give you now are examples of competencies and try and map them to an extent to the 3 registers we've just outlined. So application and knowledge and understanding, okay? If you're an RSI Tech, you might be responsible, for example, or you have to demonstrate that if you carry out a particular procedure, such as bacterial transformation or PCR, that you actually understand the principles of the experiment. You basically understand the science underpinning the standard operating procedure. That's typical of an RSI Tech, demonstrating the science underpinning the actual procedure that they're talking about. Whereas, for example, in the context of that PCR, that first diagram, optimizing or troubleshooting the method is something typically undertaken by a registered scientist as opposed to a registered science technician. Apart from classical science within the lab, much of what goes on in the lab now is actually undertaken by analytical platforms. And in the case of an RSI Tech, that might involve housekeeping of that platform, maintaining it in an accurate way. Whereas for an RSI, it may be that as part and parcel of the optimizing of protocols we've mentioned, that you're actually responsible for optimizing protocols, scripts on the equipment itself. Of course, if you're a field scientist, application of knowledge and understanding might actually involve taking pilot methods within the lab and adapting them to the field. So that's another example of something that typically a CSI would do. And as I've mentioned before, apart from actually carrying out experiments, following standard operating procedures to generate data, it may be that you're responsible for any of the registers for actually researching what you do in order to work up a method. In addition, there may be actual literature research pertaining to the actual output of data from those experiments, data analysis. Maybe you've actually found as a CSI a better statistical tool to analyze your data. Maybe similarly as a CSI, you've scripted the actual generation of data, that output, using something like R. Planning an organization can be as simple as meeting a deadline, planning your time as an R-side tech to meet the experimental priorities of your academic supervisor. In addition to actually prioritizing your time in terms of project work vis-a-vis your supervisor, technician supervisor, it can actually be about how you go about organizing the lab for others and balancing that with your own personal project, your own science commitments. One aspect of actually competency B is actually demonstrating that you work to certain standards. So that could typically be health and safety, laboratory safety, COSH in higher education labs and industry, CLEAPS in schools. But it can be other sorts of standards as well, such as how you actually go about disposing and storing of chemicals. It can also be ecological things, such as how you actually go about rendering your lab more green. Do you recycle your tips, for example? And if we look at, say, standards in the context of registers, an R-side tech would be expected in their competency form to demonstrate that they've actually understood a COSH form, okay, that they understand the health and safety, good laboratory practice associated with the operating procedures, perhaps that they've discussed in competency A. Maybe as an R-side, you're responsible for training such individuals. So you'd be expected to demonstrate that you can write those competency forms and train others. Remember, we talked about training in the context of the actual R-side register. And finally, as a CSI, maybe you're responsible for working up a new type of health and safety modality. Increasingly, COSH forms, as they're known, are moving from hard copies, PDF copies, to actually digitally based database software programs. And perhaps you're training other R-sides in the use of databases like Sevron, who in turn then disseminate that information, as we've just said, by training others. Another example of planning an organization, which is basically sort of germane to more recent time, family leave. Maybe you're a CSI who is responsible for training others, and it's actually making sure that if you go off on maternity leave, that the people that you train know what they're doing in your absence. Maybe it's the reciprocal of that. Maybe you're the other side of the table as an RSI or as an RSI tech, and you're responsible to that senior technician or PI who is about to go on paternity or maternity leave. And it's actually planning in such a way that in their absence, you know how to perform your role independently. Finally, during the recent COVID crisis and lockdown, we all had to change how we worked, okay? We have to adapt our schedules, plan and organize accordingly. Interpersonal skills and communication, as I've said, is about dealing with specialists and non-specialists alike. So that may be as simple as talking to a team if you're a senior technician or team leader looking to demonstrate, or should I say, achieve CSI. So it's talking about how you manage your team as a team leader. As an RSI or similarly a CSI, it may be how you train junior technicians or new PhD students in the performance of science, teaching them the standard operating procedure and the associated COSH that we've referred to in competencies A and B. An example of dealing with non-specialists would be if you're a CSI, for example, maybe you manage a simple consumables budget for the lab, and that might involve auditing what you spend and conferring with finance about the fact that you are expected to demonstrate that you're sticking to spending limits and justify that spending. So that's a very good example of actually communicating with non-specialists in your own organization, non-scientists. I've mentioned international students because this really sort of impinges on modality of communication. What do I mean by that? Well, apart from talking about the different groups that you deal with, specialists and non-specialists, interpersonal skills and communication is also about the tools that you bring to bear in terms of how you effectively communicate. So with international students, it may be that their spoken English is not as good as their written English. I've encountered this, okay? So it may be that you gear your training towards written communication in addition to spoken communication if the language aspect is not as good. A picture, to use a cliche, is worth 1,000 words. So I know sometimes foreign students whose first language isn't English, if you actually use annotated diagrams as part and parcel of your lab-based or data-based training, that can actually get across what you're trying to say much more effectively than in the absence of diagrams. And of course, if we're going to talk about modalities of communication, we can actually invoke COVID and lockdown. During COVID and lockdown, we all became experts in remote communication. So talk about how you mastered, say, Teams or Zoom. Finally, communication isn't just about working in labs. It can be presenting results to your colleagues using PowerPoint, or it could be that you've devised a poster in PowerPoint or using Microsoft publication at a conference. You presented at a conference. It may be that you've given an oral presentation at a conference. So these are all types of communication that you can bring to bear in terms of your written answers in your competency reports. Professional practice in part can be thought of as an extension to A. So in A, you might have a method that you've troubleshooted, okay? You've improvised on a standard operating procedure to actually generate data. But in D, you can talk about how you revisit that to use a new method or to fundamentally, in a root and branch way, actually address problems that you have as an RSci or a CSci in A in a more fundamental way. So it could be that in A, that, for example, that you use pilot methods in the lab to generate data. But in D, you revisit that and you look at examples of different pilot methods and you pick the one that is most optimal for your particular experimental procedures. And then you use that in your final analysis. Method innovation. It could be that you actually replace one type of method with a more up-to-date, a more fundamental method to actually generate improved data. The other thing that professional practice pertains to is scoping and planning projects. As an RSci tech, that might be as simple as actually communicating with sales reps and actually trying different types, evaluating different types of plastic consumables, let's say for DNA or RNA purification. By trialing those different consumables, do you in effect create an improvised SOP where what you're using in terms of consumables leads to a cheaper method or a quicker method or better quality data? It could be that as an RSci, or even in fact as an RSci tech, in addition to talking about improvements in a root and branch way to your professional practice, your data, it could be that you actually discuss improvements to how you organize the lab to make it actually function in a more seamless way for other people in the lab or indeed yourself. So organizational improvements, okay. It isn't just about what you do at the bench in terms of your experimental science. Finally, as a CSci, you might be asked to do something more ambitious, you might be asked to actually scope a project, not just improvise on small consumables in the context of an existing procedure, okay? It could be that you're working up a new method from scratch. So you have to think about the costings of the new equipment that might be used. You have to think about the time it takes to train up others in the use of that method, okay? What are the cost implications and how long will it take to actually generate new reliable data, okay? So that's a more ambitious type of scoping a project that is commensurate with someone typically who is a senior technician aspiring to gain a CSI. Finally, there is one more competency that I actually haven't discussed, okay? And that is competency E. And really, E is broken down into E1 and E2. E1 is about codes of conduct and practice, okay? So this can be aspiring, or should I say being mindful of ethical codes. They can include things like up-to-date equality and diversity and inclusion courses, and how you actually use those in your daily practice in, let's say, a multicultural environment. It can be about data protection, okay? How you actually go about archiving data in a sort of GDPR compliant way. But it can also be other types of ethical practice. Perhaps in a clinical environment, you are dealing with patient samples. So it's about how you use those in your research, such as the fact that you have to use samples that have been anonymized, okay? And all of this is sort of comes under the umbrella of the Human Tissue Act 2004. And that's an example of a code of conduct. Finally, it can be things like professional registration, okay? Maybe you're responsible for talking about professional registration within your own environment, or perhaps you're taking it on, okay? Finally, you may be involved as a CSI in the actual rollout of Athena Swan, okay, which links to equality, diversity, inclusion in your own institute. Or it may be that you attend courses so that you're mindful of the goals, okay, the objectives of Athena Swan within your institute. Finally, the very last competency is E2. And you can really think about, E2 as continuing professional development. What are you doing at the moment that facilitates practice in your job? And what will you do in the future, okay, that will enhance your job? So essentially, if we look at E2, if we look at CPD, there are different modalities. I've mentioned 5 here. So one is work-based learning, secondments to learn new technical skills, shadowing to actually learn new techniques from specialists within your lab, formal educational learning, okay, gaining qualifications, writing articles, attending training courses, okay? And some of those courses that you attend don't have to be just formal academic qualifications. They may be specific vocational qualifications outside your institute or set up by your employers that train you in a specific thing that allows you to actually carry out your job more effectively. Professional activity, that's about presenting at a conference on behalf of your employer. It could be that you're involved with an outside licensed body or charity, and it's about basically carrying out activities for them. Maybe you're involved in chairing a session at a conference or organizing a conference as a CSI, okay? Maybe as an R-Sci Tech or an R-Sci, you're giving a small presentation at that conference. That's all part and parcel of your professional development, which falls under professional activity. Self-directed learning is really reading books, reviewing books, reflecting on your own practice to actually improve your practice, okay? And the final one is strategic work, community work, transferable skills, strategic thinking, okay, which impacts on your job in the here and now, and also to actually improve how you perform your job in the future. Continuing professional development also covers things like professional registration and Athena Swan. Thank you.